Anthony Saich. He's the professor at the Harvard University. Professor, welcome to Bloomberg HT.
Thank you.
My first question is, there's an ongoing tension between US and China, and Secretary of State Antony Blinken stood by President Biden after Biden referred to Chinese President Xi as a dictator. How do you see the future of China-US relationship?
Well, I don't think President Biden's comment on Xi being a dictator is really going to make any difference. Of course, Chinese side expressed great umbrage, but really they're looking at the bigger picture. Now, in terms of the bigger picture, I think we have to say that things are about as bad as they can be at the current time. And I think the problem here is that if you look at the comments from both sides, it's clear that Washington sees the fault lying with Beijing and Beijing sees the fault lying with Washington. So from Beijing's perspective, it's all about containment, that no matter what it's doing, the US is going to try and hold back China's development. If you look at it from Washington's side, they see it differently, that much of this is brought about because of the aggression from China internationally, and because of what it sees as its unfair economic practices domestically. So I think we're going to see really into the future just a tense relationship. But having said that, decoupling is obviously impossible, which is why I think the administration in Washington has now started using de-risking and diversifying. Because if we look at the bigger picture, China's not going away. And the economies are so intertwined that we have to find some way of getting to grips with how to deal with China. And as you well know, I mean, there are many issues in the global sphere that require the two countries to be able to come to some form of cooperation, whether that's global commons, the obvious example being climate change, whether it's global engagement around natural disasters, or even global regulation on cross-border trade, cybersecurity, those kinds of things. So some kind of flaw has to be put in the relationship so that a minimum of cooperation can be achieved in those areas.
And Secretary Yellen, Treasury Secretary, is planning to go to China in July and also reestablish the contact with Beijing, her counterpart. So do you think Yellen's China trip would be a search for economic common ground?
Well, I think we're going to see a couple of visits coming up because in November, probably General Secretary Xi Jinping will be coming to the US for the APEC meeting. And I think China wants to keep things as balanced as possible to ensure that that meeting goes relatively smoothly. So yes, I do think when Treasury Secretary Yellen visits, is to try and establish some basic principles on looking at the economic agenda. As I said earlier, essentially Washington has come to the conclusion that these economies are so intertwined that decoupling is impossible, which is why they're using the phrase de-risking. And some common ground needs to be found in that area. And if we look at businesses, they already have that common ground. US investment is ticking along. Sales by US companies in China is booming. And so there's an economic reality there that Washington is going to have to get to grips with. Will it resolve the underlying complaints from Washington and indeed from the business community? I doubt it. And those are around things such as what they see as an uneven playing ground, the state support to state-owned industries, the way those function both domestically and internationally. And the role of those is such a key component of Xi Jinping's economic strategy, and indeed his political strategy, that I think it's very hard to see significant progress in those areas. And what we've seen in the past is even when agreements have been made on those areas, it really has not resulted in any significant movement in actual practice.
Mm-hmm. And I would like to come to Russian illegal invasion in Ukraine. Do you think China would be an honest broker ending the war in Ukraine?
Well, it's obviously the case that there's no other country that has as much leverage on Russia as China does. It's obviously its major trading partner. It's been its major supporter, although it's been trying to tread a fine line between not alienating the West while still basically parroting the arguments put forward by Russia. And if we look at the 12-point plan that it put forward, it didn't really provide any specific or concrete solutions and did not include the wording in the resolution passed by the UN General Assembly that Russian troops should withdraw from the occupied territories. So it's hard to see really what China can push in terms of an agreement. Now, because it's always going to continue its support for President Putin. I mean, unless in some way he's removed or the system collapses. So I think really where China could play an important role is really at the point where such a stalemate has come about in terms of the conflict that people are looking around for concessions, and the West begins to accept that maybe those concessions might include ceding something to President Putin and his desire to hold on to some of the territory in the Ukraine. At that point, I could see China playing a role. I think it was fairly clear in the fact that President Xi went to visit Putin in Moscow. He didn't visit Zelensky, but he only did that later in terms of a phone call, but at the request of President Zelensky himself. So it's a difficult line for them to tread. I think they're going to be reactive. I don't see them being positive in terms of pushing a practical settlement.
And another question, the Belt and Road Initiative. And there are some problems with this initiative. Do you think it's a failure from the Beijing perspective? What's your thoughts on this initiative?
Well, I think from Beijing's perspective, I think their answer would be no, but then they don't accept responsibility for things that go wrong anyway. But I think if we look at it, I mean, if we think about what was the Belt and Road initially designed to do and what is it doing now, I think we come up with a more complex answer. The initial drive for the Belt and Road Initiative was essentially to export the excess capacity that China had built up because of its stimulus plans following the financial crisis of 0809. And of course, that meant investment in big infrastructure projects and of course, ones that would benefit China, like the corridor through Pakistan, and also major energy projects. And as you say, they've run into problems. There's been difficulties with repayments and so forth. But what we've actually seen is a shift in what China now views the BRI to be. And now they talk about the green BRI, for example. Yeah. And they're much more focused on cutting edge technologies, exporting through the BRI. And I think from Beijing's perspective, that has two advantages. One, is less expensive than building huge infrastructure projects. But secondly, I think it meets Beijing's policy goal. And if we look at what Beijing has been doing, it's been investing heavily in what it sees as the cutting edge technologies for the future. And when Beijing looks at history, I think they realize that those countries that set standards for cutting edge technologies become global powers. I think that's the game that Beijing is playing. And I think they now see the BRI as being the way to export those technologies to bring a variety of countries into a web built around Chinese-focused technologies. So I think if we look at BRI within those changing contexts, I don't think Beijing would necessarily see it as a failure.
Okay. And my last question is about Africa. We see Chinese and Russian business sectors are influencing in Africa. Recently, President Biden had an African summit at Washington, D.C. So how do you read the competition between US and China in Africa, and what United States should do more better than China in Africa?
Well, I think, of course, America has woken up rather late to what was really taking place in Africa. And I would say not just Africa. I think this also includes the Middle East. I think it also includes Latin America these days. Well, the starting point is that China is providing investment the United States cannot provide or has not been able to provide. And going back to a point I made earlier, if we look at the spread of telecommunications technologies across Africa, China has a huge lead in that. It's already providing not just 5G, but in other countries, it's already put in basically 3G platforms. So it's moved ahead. It's also taken control of a lot of local media content in Africa. And all of that gives us a huge head start over the United States in terms of where we are with the current situation in Africa. And I don't think the US just focusing on values is going to be sufficient or fundamental in gaining or regaining ground in sub-Saharan Africa. Countries might sympathize, but they still want the investment. And unless that investment comes from the United States, they're likely to turn to financing agencies from China. So one, yes, increasing investment if they can pull together other partners to improve levels of investment in Africa. I think that's unlikely that it can get to the levels that China has provided in the past. Of course, there is the point you made earlier that BRI investment, and they include Africa in BRI now, has been declining. So that might give the United States an opportunity to become more engaged. But I think there's limits in terms of what Congress would allow in terms of spending. So that's going to make it very difficult. Mm-hmm. I think perhaps a second point is the acceptance in Washington that we are really actually in a multipolar world. It's not just the US and China. And there, I think perhaps giving voice to some of the other countries to provide a broader range of discussion about ways forward, policy challenges that give key African nations a stake in that might be a way of decentering China's influence and power in the region. But I think that requires some flexibility from Washington and some acceptance that the interests of others need to be taken seriously. Why has South Africa been more supportive of Russia's engagement in an invasion of the Ukraine? Why has it been more sympathetic towards China? Why has a country like Brazil been extremely ambivalent and at times looked quite positively on its relationship with China? I think Washington has to take those into account as being really serious concerns by those countries.
Mm-hmm. Professor Saich, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you very much.